Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're going to dive into a bit of a thought experiment. It's a calm, reflective look at our modern society, our digital habits, and something called the dehydration of meaning. Basically, we're exploring why civilization actually loses context as it produces more and more records. Think about it for a second. Our civilization today captures absolutely everything. Every human action leaves a trace. We're talking photos on your phone, location data tracking your morning commute, endless search histories, and now miles and miles of conversation logs with AI. We are preserving more records than any previous society in human history. But here's the paradox we really need to unpack today. Producing more records doesn't necessarily guarantee that we're preserving more meaning. We tend to have this built-in assumption that if we just retain the data, if we hit save or screenshot that chat, we've successfully saved its true significance. But extracting and storing an event is actually very, very different from understanding it. So that brings us to the central question of this whole topic. If more is recorded, does more meaning actually survive? Think about a time you scrolled back through an old message thread or read a transcript of a conversation. You can see exactly what was said. You can prove who was technically right, and you've got the exact timestamp to back it up. But do you remember why those words were necessary in the first place? Do you remember why a different word wasn't chosen, or maybe why someone hesitated for just a few seconds before typing? There is a massive, often invisible gap between saving a factual record and preserving the actual living truth of that moment. What happens is, when an event is recorded, the raw statement survives, sure. But the fragile, invisible elements of human interaction, they completely fade away. Things like bodily condition. Like, were you completely exhausted when you agreed to that? The history of the relationship. The shared assumptions in the room. What was intentionally left unsaid. The sequence of events. A record essentially extracts a portable fragment, just words or numbers, but it leaves behind the temperature of the room and all those unresolved possibilities. The record remains, absolutely. But the environment that made it meaningful, that does not. Let's trace how a single statement actually travels in our modern ecosystem. It's kind of like a game of telephone. It starts as words spoken in a very specific situation. Then, boom, it becomes a transcript. From there, someone pulls out a punchy short quotation. That quote gets indexed by an algorithm, and suddenly it's a search result. Then, maybe it's condensed into a quick summary. And finally, it gets used as evidence for a completely different narrative. Now, the words themselves might stay perfectly accurate throughout this entire journey, but their relational surroundings just gradually vanish. Who were they actually talking to? What specific question were they answering? What silence came before they spoke? The meaning doesn't simply become false. Instead, its possible range of interpretation becomes much, much narrower. And that highlights the crucial difference between preserving a record versus preserving context. Look, preserving a record is highly efficient. An event becomes information, it goes into storage, and bam, it's ready for search. But preserving context? That's messy. It involves the relationship, time, silence, the record itself, and finally, reinterpretation. Context is not just some extra explanation or a neat little caption added to a file. Context is the actual environment in which meaning can arise again. Meaning doesn't just live inside words. It lives in the interference between language, silence, history, and you, the observer. Which brings us to the core concept here, the dehydration of meaning. I love this metaphor. Think of dried leaves, or preserved space food, or a faded photograph. Dehydrated objects preserve their basic visual outline, right? But they lose their softness, their temperature, their scent, their capacity for change. When a record loses its context, it doesn't necessarily lose all its meaning entirely. Rather, it becomes incredibly easy to reduce to a single, rigid interpretation. All the contextual moisture is just gone. So a provisional, maybe tentative thought suddenly reads like a permanent, hard-coded intention. A brief moment of hesitation solidifies into absolute certainty. And a silence, which maybe was just chosen to keep the peace in a relationship, is mistakenly recorded forever as evidence of absence. This leads us right into the structural condition of our modern archives, or what we call the paradox of archival civilization. We have greater recording capacity today, which naturally enables greater searchability and super efficient summarization. That in turn allows for the blazing fast redistribution of information. But this highly efficient chain results in one unavoidable consequence: less contact with the original situation. Records circulate so much faster today precisely because they are detached from their complex, messy origins. Let's face it, a short quote is way easier to share than a nuanced 2-hour conversation. A data point completely stripped of its background is just easier to compare. Because ultimately, if information is easy to preserve, it's also incredibly easy to detach. Our information environment actively rewards records that can be stripped of their context and moved without any friction. And this is so much more than just the usual information overload complaint. It's a structural condition where records travel farther and further away from the real-world situations that actually produce them. We somehow built a society that rarely loses records, but constantly loses where those records actually came from. Now, we have to talk about how artificial intelligence interacts with all this lost context. Think of AI as this giant atmosphere sitting over our records, just constantly searching, comparing, and reconnecting them. But here's the catch. A background that was never recorded in the first place cannot be directly observed by a machine. So what happens? You have a recorded fragment plus a ton of missing context, which results in what's called a probabilistic reconstruction. The AI literally fills in the blanks with surrounding records or explanations that are statistically plausible. And these reconstructions can sound incredibly coherent and natural without actually being correctly connected to the original situation. But to be fair, we shouldn't frame this solely as an AI problem. AI really just acts as a mirror. It exposes what human civilization already decided to preserve and what we decided to just cut away. So where do we go from here? If trying to record absolutely every piece of context is impossible, because let's be real, doing that would be suffocating, like trying to map the world at a one-to-one scale. What do we actually do? The goal here isn't to argue for perfect, infinite recording. The goal is to ask, how do we leave the margins open? How do we pass records to the future in a way that doesn't force a single, closed, dehydrated meaning? We can start doing this by deliberately acknowledging what was unknown, leaving traces of the choices we didn't make, and actually documenting the hesitations. We don't just need a machine to replay the past perfectly. We need to leave enough breathing room so that future observers can continually reinterpret it. So I'll leave you with this. What are you truly saving when you save a record today? And how can we ensure the future is allowed to understand it differently?